Once upon a time, there was this guy named John, and every day John would walk his girlfriend Mariella home from school. Except he didn't really walk her all the way home from school. Instead, John just walked Mariella 2/3 of the way from his house to her house, and then he turned around and went back home. So exactly how far did John walk with Mariella? Let's see if we can find the spot where he stopped on our map. Here's the direct path from John's house to Mariella's house. John would only walk with Mariella 2/3 of the way. It's important to note that John's house was located at -3, 3, and Mariella's house was located at 6, -3. To find the point that's 2/3 of the way along the route, we can't use the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula would give us the halfway point. Instead, we're going to do something else. But first, we're going to have to look at the vertical distance and the horizontal distance between their two houses. The vertical distance between their houses is 6, and the horizontal distance between their houses is 9. To find the 2/3 point, what we want to do is figure out what's 2/3 of 6 and what's 2/3 of 9. So the distance that John is actually going to walk is going to be 2/3 of the vertical distance. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. And 2/3 of the horizontal distance. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's take a look at where these points intersect. Right about here. So John would walk along this route with Mariella, and then Mariella would go home while John would walk back to his own house. We can use a formula to do this too. 3, -1 is our 2/3 point. Let's see how we could use a formula to do that. This is what our word problem might look like if we saw it as a verbal form instead of on the graph. Find the point that is 2/3 of the distance from -3, 3, remember that's John's house, to 6, -3, that's Mariella's house. Our formula basically says x1 plus 2/3 of the difference between x2 and x1, and then y1 plus 2/3 of the difference between y2 and y1. Let's do some substitution. Let's look at just the x's first. x1 is -3 and x2 is 6. That means we're going to have -3 plus 2/3 of 6 minus -3. Let's start within our grouping symbols. 6 minus -3 is the same thing as 6 plus 3. 6 plus 3 is 9. This should start to feel familiar. We found 2/3 of 9 earlier. 2/3 of 9 is 6. So this is going to turn into -3 plus 6. -3 plus 6 is 3. That's our new x-coordinate. Now we need to repeat this for our y-coordinates. Let's repeat the process for y now. y1 is 3 and y2 is -3. So we'll have 3 plus 2/3 of -3 minus 3. -3 minus 3 is -6. So we're finding 2/3 of -6. This is like earlier when we found 2/3 of 6. Remember, we said that 2/3 of 6 was 4. And it is. We went 4 units down. Similarly, here, we're going to have 2/3 of -6 give us -4. And 3 plus -4 is going to be -1. So -1 is our y-coordinate. Let's put our two coordinates together. 3, -1 is our 2/3 point. One interesting consideration is to look at what would happen if we look for the halfway point. Would this formula be the same as the midpoint formula? It ought to be. They both find the halfway point. That's what the midpoint is. Let's take a look. If we use 1/2 instead of 2/3, what happens to our formula when we simplify it? Our first step will be to distribute the 1/2. Now that we've distributed the 1/2, let's combine like terms. x1 minus 1/2 x1 is 1/2 x1. Similarly, y1 minus 1 half y1 is 1 half y1. And there's our midpoint formula, half of x1 plus half of x2, comma half of y1 plus 1 half of y2. There are other ways we could write it, of course. Factoring out the common factor of 1 half gives us the form that we're more used to, and we can also write it as division. Since multiplication by a fraction is really the same thing as division, all three of these things are the same thing. So yes, when we're finding the halfway point, this formula is just a fancy form of the midpoint formula. It's just additionally useful because it can also help us find other points, like the 2/3 point, or the 3/4 point, or the 1/3 point. The only thing that we need to change in our formula is this fraction. If I wanted to find the quarter point, I would use 1/4 instead of 1 half. If I wanted to find the point that's 5/6 of the way along a journey, I would use 5/6 instead of 1 half. To find 2/3 of a number, just multiply that number by 2/3. 2/3 times 6 is going to be the same thing as 2/3 times 6 over 1. We'll just multiply the top and the top, the bottom and the bottom, to get 12 over 3. 12 over 3 is 4. 2/3 of 6 is 4. Let's do the same thing with 9. When we multiply our numerators, we get 18. When we multiply our denominators, we get 3. 18 over 3 is 6. So 2/3 of 9 is 6. Let's take those numbers back to our map.